Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chel Gimel and we'll be learning today in Yirtzeh Hashem Daf Chaf Beis Amud Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We are holding in Siman Reish Nun Gimel Sif Beis in the middle of the very complex sugya of the Isurei D'Rabbanan of Chazara, Shehiyah, and Chazara. Our learning should be as chus for Achei Kobeis Yisrael Hanasunim Batzara Bashivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha Hamakim Yirachem Aleim V'Yitziam Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelu L'Oira Umishibud L'Geula Hashta Bagalav Zman Kariv and Emarmein. Our learning should be as chus Refuah Shalema for David ben Belima B'Sar Shar Chayil Yisrael. I just want to again stress at the beginning of this year today that all of us should be having in mind to use our klei umnus, to use our tefillas for Gans Klal Yisrael. That's our klei umnus. That's where our koyach is. Our koyach is bepeh. Our koyach is betfila. We should all be concentrating on doing whatever we can to improve our tefillah. So we're here in Siman Reish Nun Gimel. We've seen already the halachas of shehiyah. So what is shehiyah? Shehiyah is when you have food, you have a pot of food, you want to leave it on a fire going into Shabbos. You want to put it on a fire at Erev Shabbos. You want to have it on the fire on Shabbos. We've seen 2 days here in the Shulchan Aruch when you could do shehiyah, when you can't do shehiyah. Why did the Chazal place restrictions on shehiyah? Primarily because of the fear of Shema Yechata B'Gecholim. Chazal were afraid you have a pot on the fire on Shabbos. There might be we have a concern that you might be driven to go ahead and stoke the coals to accelerate the cooking process to make the food hotter. And because of that, they put restrictions on shehiyah, and we covered that in 4 shiurim in Reish Nun Gimel Sif Aleph. Now, in the previous year, we started Sif Beis, where the Shulchan Aruch pivoted to now discussing the question of Chazara. What is the question of Chazara? Well, when we're dealing with shehiyah, you're not actually putting a pot on the fire on Shabbos. You're putting a pot on the fire on Erev Shabbos. You want it to remain there on Shabbos. So you're not doing anything that looks like bishul. You're not putting a pot on the fire. You're not actually doing a maisa on Shabbos. Yet Chazal saw fit to place restrictions on shehiyah because of the fear of Shema Yechata B'Gecholim. Chazara is a step more chomer than that. By Chazara, you're taking a pot that had been removed from the fire, and now you want to put it back on the fire on Shabbos. So now you're doing a maisa on Shabbos. You're taking a pot, you're putting it on the fire. And it certainly looks a lot like bishul. When you take a pot and you put it on the fire on Shabbos, it looks like bishul, tastes like bishul, smells like bishul. It's uncomfortably close to bishul. And therefore, Chazal placed restrictions on Chazara. When can you do Chazara? When can you not do Chazara? So far, what we've seen in the Shulchan Aruch is the Dei Rishona. We've seen the first opinion over here in the Shulchan Aruch, where the Mechaber said, whenever you want to do Chazara on Shabbos, whenever it comes that you want to put a pot back on the fire on Shabbos, there are basically 5 tanoim. There are 5 conditions that must be met in order for you to be able to put a pot that was removed from the fire back onto the fire on Shabbos. What are those tanoim? So the first, most basic tanai is that the food has to be mavushal kol tzarchan. If you want to take a pot of food and you want to put it on a fire on Shabbos, you better make sure it's mavushal kol tzarchan. It has to be fully cooked, because if that food is not going to be fully cooked, well, then you're really going ahead and treading on the question of bishul. You might be doing actual bishul if it's not fully cooked. The second condition is that the food has to still be hot. This is, again, if the food is not hot, if it's cold and you put it on the fire, especially by a davar lach, you might be over on actual bishul by putting that pot back onto the fire. So the first 2 tanoim are necessary to make sure that you're not poshit over on bishul. The food has to be mavushal kol tzarchai, and it still has to be hot. Condition number 3 is that the kira has to be garuf v'katum. It has to be either shoveled out of the coals or the coals have to be banked in order for you to put the pot back onto the fire. And this is, first of all, it takes care of the problem of Shemi Yechata B'Gechalim. If we're going to allow you to put a pot back onto a kira that's not Garafikatum, maybe you'll want to go stoke the coals in order to increase the heat of the pot. Also, if you're doing chazara onto a kira that's not Garafikatum, again, it looks dangerously close to bishul. That's derech bishul. The way you do bishul is you put a pot onto a kira that has burning coals in it. So if it's not Garafikatum, we're not going to allow you to do chazara. So far we have 3 tanoim. Mavushal called tzarchai, oide reiseach, it's still hot, and it has to be garaf or katum. Condition number 4 is that when you took the pot off the fire, it had to be daitoi lahachzira. You had to have in mind that you're taking it off, but you're going to put it back on. And then finally, condition number 5 is that it has to be oide biyadoi. You have to be always holding the pot. It has to be that you took the pot off and you didn't let go of the pot. It was oide biyadoi. You always had it in your hand. Incidentally, according to Rav Moshe, when we say that it has to be oide biyadoi, it doesn't mean that you can't put it down. You could take the pot of cholent off the blech and you could put it down on a trivet as long as you keep your hands on the pot. Oide biyadai, the Rishiva Zatzal said, means oide biyadai. You have to be still holding it in your hand. The fact that you put it down is not a problem. According to Rav Moshe, you could even put it on gabi karka. As long as you're still holding it, you could still put it back on. Now, these last 3, the last 3 conditions that we have over here, the fact that it has to be, well, the last 2 really. The fact that it has to be that you had daitoi lahachzira. The fact that it has to be oide biyadoi. What do those tanoim, what do those conditions accomplish? So what they accomplish is like this. The problem with chazara, like we said, is you're putting a pot onto the fire on Shabbos, and it looks and feels dangerously like bishul. Now, what Chazal did not want to allow you to do on Shabbos was what we call bishul mitchila. What they didn't want is, they didn't want you doing an initial placement of the pot onto the fire on Shabbos. Now, when I say initial placement, I'm not talking about where the food is raw. If food is raw, you're never allowed to put it on a fire on Shabbos. That would be bishul 101. What I mean is, imagine it's during the week, and you decide that you're having leftover chicken soup for supper Sunday night. So, at 5 o'clock, you go to the refrigerator, you take the pot out of the refrigerator, and you put it onto the fire to reheat it. That's an initial placement of the pot on Shabbos. Your preparation for supper tonight is to take the pot out of the fridge and put it down on the fire in order to reheat it. Chazal did not want to allow you to do that on Shabbos, even with fully cooked food, where there's no bishul problem, even if it would be hot. They didn't want to allow you to do an initial placement of a pot onto the fire on Shabbos because it's too much merzi kimavushal. It looks too much like bishul. So what the Chazal did was they put tanoim in place to make chazara permissible, and what some of those tanoim do is, it makes it clear that when you're putting that pot onto the fire, it's not initial placement. It's chazara. It's pshat that the pot was on the fire, I took it off momentarily, and I'm putting it back on. That's not merzi kimavushal. Merzi kimavushal is when you do an initial placement of a pot onto the fire. That's merzi kimavushal. But when a pot was on the fire, and you just took it off for a moment and put it back, that doesn't look like initial cooking on Shabbos. So the tanoim that Chazal made, most specifically the tanai of daitoi lahachzira, that when you took it off you had in mind to put it back, and the tanai of oide biyadoi, that you have to still be holding onto the pot, what those accomplish is that now it's very clear that the act that you're doing is only an act of chazara. It's not an act of initial placement. So that's what we have over here from the day of Rishona. And there's two things that I want to be very clear about when it comes to this day of Rishona, because it's going to stand in contrast to the day of Shnia. According to this day of Rishona, the guidelines, these restrictions, the need to meet these Tanoim in order for Chazara to be mutter, they apply equally to if you had a pot on the fire on Shabbos, your cholent is on the flame Shabbos morning, you took it off on Shabbos and you want to put it back on Shabbos. In order to put it back, you need to meet all of these requirements. According to the day of Rishona, the same halacha would be, let's say it's Friday, it's Erev Shabbos, right before Shabbos, you're setting up the blech. You took the pot off the fire, and now somehow you got delayed, and now suddenly it's Shkia, and you want to put the pot back onto the fire. According to the day of Rishona, if you meet all of these Tanoim, the food is mavushal kol tzarchai, it's still hot, it's gar fekatim, so you have a blech, you had daitay lachzira, your intent when you took it off was to put it back on, and it's oida biyadai, you could put it back on Shabbos. After Shkia, you could put it back on, because you met all of the Tanaim of Chazara. And by the way, that's very clear, what I just said. It's very clear in a Shar Tzion. It's Shar HaTzion, Ois Cotton, Mem Dalet. That even if you took it off before Shabbos and you want to put it on after Shabbos started, as long as you meet all the Tanoim that are necessary for Chazara, you're allowed to put it back on. And the same thing, Shabbos by day. You took the pot off the fire on Shabbos, and you want to put it back on Shabbos. According to the day of Rishona, you need to meet all of these 5 Tanoim. The day of Shnia is going to argue on the day of Rishona. The day of Shnia is going to say a very interesting thing. The day of Shnia says, let's get to the root of the problem of Chazara. Why did Chazal place restrictions on Chazara? Because they wanted to be abundantly clear that when you put the pot back on the fire, it's a continuation of the original placement of the pot on the fire, and it's not an initial placement of the pot onto the fire. The Day Shnia says, bearing that in mind, there's no need to place restrictions on Chazara if the pot came off the fire on Shabbos and went back onto the fire on Shabbos. The Day Shnia says, if the pot came off on Shabbos and it's going back on Shabbos, then it's very clear that putting the pot back onto the fire is a continuation of the initial placement of the pot onto the fire. The only time we need to put restrictions on Chazara, says the Day Shnia, is if the pot came off the fire before Shabbos, and now you want to put the pot back on after Shabbos began, then we need to put restrictions on Chazara. Because now it looks like putting the pot back onto the fire is initial placement. Why? Because you're not putting it back. It never was on the fire on Shabbos. If it was on the fire on Shabbos, so it was on the fire on Shabbos, and you're putting it back on the fire on Shabbos. So it's not an initial placement. So there's no need for restrictions against Chazara. Now, when I say there's no need for restrictions, obviously the food still has to be mavushal kol tzarchai. Obviously the food still has to be hot. Otherwise you're going to run into bishul problems. The only restrictions that you don't need, according to the Day Shnia, is it doesn't matter if you had in mind to put it back on when you take it off, and it doesn't matter if you put it down. According to the Day Shnia, if on Shabbos you took your cholent off the fire and you did not have in mind to put it back, and you put it down and you let go, according to the Day Shnia, you could put it back on afterwards. Why? Because the Day Shnia holds, since the cholent was on the fire on Shabbos and you're putting it back on Shabbos, it's very clear that what you're doing is Chazara, not initial placement. And the only thing Chazal were concerned about was initial placement. According to the Day Rishona, that's not true. The Day Rishona says, even if you took it off on Shabbos and you want to put it back on Shabbos, you still need that when you took it off, you had in mind to put it back, and you still need that you never let go. Why? Because we're still worried that unless you had in mind to put it back, And unless you held it the whole time, it looks like initial placement of the pot onto the fire on Shabbos. It's mechzi kimavushal, and Chazal would have answered that. And now we're going to see this inside the Day Shnia. We already covered the Day Rishina. We're going to see the Day Shnia now inside. But before we do that, we have just a drop of housekeeping. There's one Mishnah Berurah that I missed in the previous year. So we're going to pick up on the bottom line of the Shulchan Aruch, in the words of the Ramah, Chav Beis Amud Aleph. In my print, it's the last two words on the line, says the Ramah. The Ramah said, according to the Day Rishina, if you meet all the 5 Tanoim that you need for Chazara to be mutter, so it was Mavushal Kol Tzarchai, it's still hot, the kira is gar fekatim, when you took the pot off, it was daita lachzira, you had in mind to put it back, and you never let go of the pot. Says the Ramah, under those conditions, va'oz mutter lahachzirai afilu lekira acheres. If you met all of those Tanoim, now you're allowed to put the pot back, not only onto the kira that you took it off of. You had the pot on one kira. You took it off the kira. Now you want to put it back onto a different kira. Says the Ramah, you would be allowed to put it back on another kira. You don't have to put it back on the same kira. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. What's the chiddush of that? Says the Mishnah Berurah is Katan Samech Beis. Afilu lekira acheres. Says the Mishnah Berurah, va'afilu im hevlo meruba merishaina. Even if the second kira is hotter than the first kira, you're allowed to put it down onto the second kira. This is still clearly an act of chazara. It doesn't look like initial placement because you met all 5 Tanoim, and therefore you're allowed to put it back on the second kira. But let's say we have a new shaila here. Let's say the pot of cholent was not on a kira. The pot of cholent was mutmad. You had insulated it in blankets and towels or what have you. Let's say you had the pot insulated in a davar she'eino moisef hevel. You didn't have it insulated in materials that add heat to the pot. You just had it insulated with materials that preserve the heat. You had it wrapped in a blanket. Ubishabas bala hishiva lekira. Now what happened was like this. You had your cholent pot nice and insulated. Now you took it out of the wrappings and you served the cholent. Now you find out that somebody wants to have hot cholent by shalashudas. Are you allowed to take it now from its hatamana and do chazara by putting it onto a kira? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Or maybe the other way. Maybe this would probably be more negeya to us nowadays. Let's say you took the cholent off the blech. And then your son says, I'd love to have hot cholent for shalashudas. So you say, you know what? I'll take the pot, I'll wrap it in towels. Now, I'm not going to wrap it in a davar she'moisef hevel. I'm not going to wrap it in something that adds heat. I know I'm not allowed to do that on Shabbos. I'll do it in a davar she'eino moisef hevel. I'll just wrap it in towels, something to preserve the heat. And your thinking is that this should be mutter because it's chazar. It was on the blech, and now I'm doing hatmana. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, you're not allowed to do that. Aser. That's aser. Dezehu pu'ula chadasha. Because the hatmana that you're doing is a new act of hatmana. This is something it wasn't. If you take it off a kira, and now you want to do hatmana, you want to wrap it, it wasn't wrapped before. That's not chazara. You're not returning it to its wrappings. Before it was on a blech. Now you want to wrap it. You're not allowed to do hatmana. On Shabbos, you're not allowed to do hatmana. Afilu b'davar she'eino moisef hevel. Even with materials that don't add heat to the food. U'kedolakaman b'siman reish nun zayin. Okay, now let's get into the meat and potatoes of today's shir. Let's get into the Day Shnia. Says the Ramah, second line down, Chav Beis Amud Beis, right by the Mishnah Berurah is Katan Samech Gimel. V'yesh oimrim. Says the Ramah, v'yesh oimrim, there are those that say, D'chol zeh, this whole discussion of placing restrictions on chazar. D'chol zeh einoi osir, there's no isser of chazara, rak kishenitoloi min akira miba'od yoim, only when you took the pot off the fire on Erev Shabbos, v'loi hechziroi ad shechashecha. And you're not putting it back onto the fire until after Shabbos starts. That's when you have to worry about chazara. If you took it off before Shabbos, and now you want to put it back on after Shabbos started? Well, putting it on the fire after Shabbos started, that, according to the Day Shnia, that looks like initial placement on the fire. So in order to be matir that chazara, we need it to be that when you took it off on Erev Shabbos, you had in mind to put it back, and we need oida b'yadai, because otherwise it looks like initial placement. Aval, however, continues the Ramah, im lekachai misham mishachashecha. But if you took the pot off the fire on Shabbos, after Shabbos started, after nightfall, then afilu hinichai al gabe karka. Even if you put it down on the ground, you let go of it, and you put it down on the ground after you took it off, and you didn't have in mind, it wasn't daitay lachzira, mutter, you're allowed to do chazara. According to this Day Shnia, you took a pot off the fire on Shabbos, and you want to put it back onto the fire on Shabbos, you don't need daitay lachzira. You don't need that when you took it off, you had in mind to put it back. You don't need oida b'yadai. Now, garif v'katum, you still need. You can't put it back onto the kira, even according to the Day Shnia. You can't put it back onto the kira if it's not mavushal called sarchai. That would be bishul. You can't put it back on the kira if it's not hot. That could be bishul. You can't put it back on the kira if the kira is not garif v'katum. Then you would have a problem of shemi yechata b'gechalim. You wouldn't be allowed to do that. But according to the Day Shnia, you don't need daitay lachzira. You don't need that you had in mind to put it back on the fire, and you don't need oida b'yadai. Why? Because, like the Mishnah Berurah is going to say, the Day Shnia holds, if you took it off on Shabbos and put it back on Shabbos, it's automatically clear that what you're doing is only an act of chazara, it's not an act of initial placement. And, says the Ramah, v'chein noyigim lahakil b'tanurim shalanu, sheyesh lehem din kira. The Ramah says that the minig is to be makel by our ovens, because our ovens have a din of akira. So the Ramah says that you could actually, he says the minig is to follow this kula dika second shita, that chazara on Shabbos does not require daitay lahachzira and does not require oida b'yadai. Now we don't do that, but that's what the Ramah says over here. V'samchin atzman al divrei hamakilin, and the ones who are noyig that way, they're relying on this kula dika second shita. But says the Ramah, v'toiv lahachmir. But it would be better to be machmir like the Day Rishona. And even if you took it off on Shabbos and you want to put it back on Shabbos, you need to meet all the 5 tanoim of chazara, including daitay lahachzira and oida b'yadai. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah over here. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Samad Gimel. V'yesh oimrim dechol zeh. Says the Mishnah Berurah Pirush. When the Ramah says that there are those that say that all of this is only negeah if you took it off before Shabbos and you put it back on after Shabbos, what does that mean, all of this? Says the Mishnah Berurah Pirush. Hadavi'ina dafka oida b'yadai gam daitay lahachzir. The 2 requirements of daitay lahachzir, that when you took it off, you had in mind to put it back, and the requirement of oida b'yadai, that's only necessary, according to the Day Shnia, if you took it off before Shabbos and you're putting it back on Shabbos. But you definitely still need garif v'katum, even according to the Day Shnia. Even if you took it off on Shabbos and put it back on Shabbos, garif v'katum you certainly need. And you also need mavusha called tzarchai, and you also need oidai reiseach. According to the Day Shnia, you only need these 2 requirements. If you took the pot off on Erev Shabbos before Shabbos started, then you need these restrictions on chazara. Why? Because now, since you didn't take the pot off on Shabbos, you took the pot off before Shabbos, and you're putting it back on later on Shabbos, now when you put it on, it looks like an initial placement. This pot wasn't on the fire on Shabbos. So when you put it on the fire now on Shabbos, it looks like initial placement. It looks like bishul, it tastes like bishul, it smells like bishul. We have a problem of mechzi kimavoshel, and we need to restrict chazara. Misham Hachi Matzrachinin al Kolpanim Aiden Biyadai. That's why we need that you should still be holding on to it. Ukahai Gavna. And the restriction, let's say, of Daito Lahazira. Ki Hechi de Leheve Hekere She'ene El Chazara. So that it should be clear that what you're doing is Chazara. But you took it off on Shabbos and put it back on Shabbos, according to the day of Shnia? That's already, everybody understands that it's only Chazara. According to the day of Shnia, if you took it off on Shabbos and you want to put it back on Shabbos, even if you put it down on the ground, it's okay. And even if when you took it off, you didn't have in mind to put it back, that's okay, according to the day of Shnia. And the rationale of the day of Shnia is, because if you took it off on Shabbos and you're putting it back on Shabbos, everybody knows it was on the Kira already on Shabbos. So it's automatically clear that what you're doing is only Chazara. The Ramah said that based on this Kuludik opinion, people are Mekel. Hainu, what does it mean that they're Mekel? What do they do? Shemachzirim l'saycha tanur b'Shabbos ma'asher noisa lehem acher shalochu min ha'chalut la'achila kedei shelo yitztanen. Now there's a mouthful over here in this short little Mishnah Berurah. What this Mishnah Berurah says is like this. Based on this day of Shnia, the day of Shnia is saying that if food was on the fire on Shabbos, you took it off on Shabbos, you want to put it back on Shabbos, you don't need Daitoi Lahachzira, and you don't need Oid B'Yadai. So based on that opinion, says the Chavetz Chaim, people had the minig that they would have their cholent in the tanur. So they're doing shehiyah in a tanur. They put the cholent into the tanur on Erev Shabbos, so I guess it's gar fekatum. The cholent is mavushal called tzarchai. They put it into the oven on Erev Shabbos. Now on Shabbos, they take the cholent out of the tanur in order to serve, and now they put it down. It wasn't necessarily daitoi lachzira, and now they go ahead and they put it back into the tanur on Shabbos. Now, one thing that's interesting that comes out of this Mishnah Berurah, and the Chazon Ish actually is chaylik on this Mishnah Berurah, what's clear over here is that according to the day of Shnia, see, the day of Rishona said that even when Chazara is mutter, even when you meet all 5 Tanoim that you need for Chazara, you're not allowed to do Chazara into a Tanur. And the Mishnah Berurah said the reason is because putting it into the Tanur is too much merzi kimavoshel. But according to the day of Shnia, who holds that if the food was in the Tanur, it was on the fire on Shabbos, and now you're putting it back on Shabbos, there are no restrictions of Chazara. Chazara is mutter even into the Tanur. And the reason is Pashut. The reason is because the day Shnia holds that once the pot was on the fire on Shabbos, there no longer are any concerns of merzi kimavoshel. If it was on the fire or in the tanner on Shabbos and you're putting it back, everybody understands that what you're doing is not initial bishul. Everybody understands that what you're doing is only chazara. So the day Shnia, according to Mishnah Berurah, holds that Chazara would be mutter even into the Tanur. The day Shnia holds, the day Rishona holds, even when Chazara is mutter, it's not mutter into a Tanur. It's only mutter on top of the Kira. Okay. Now, the Ramah said that the minig was to be mekel, but then the Ramah said the toiv la'achmir. But on the other hand, it's proper to be machmir. Ois Katan Samach Zayin says to Mishnah Berurah, why is it toiv la'achmir? Ki harbe poiskim choken al haran. Because many poiskim disagree with this day of Shnia, this kuludika opinion of the Ran. V'oid, and there's another reason why you should be machmir. Ki ha-beis Yosef sover shegam haran lo hitter ela al gabi kira v'loi b'soichai. I just told you the chiddush that the Mishnah Berurah says in Ois Katan Samach Vav. Says the Mishnah Berurah now, a lot of people don't agree with that. A lot of people hold that even the day of Shnia would not be mater chazara into a tanner. There would only be mater chazara al gabe akir. The Gama Magen Avram b'sif Katan Lamin Hey mitzadet ka Beis Yosef ayin sham, and the Magen Avram agrees with that Beis Yosef who says that even the day of Shnia would not be mater chazara into a tanner, even though the food was in the tanner already on Shabbos. Umi adif a tanner shalanu mikira. our tanurim are no better than their kiras. Nevertheless, the Mishnah Berurah says, sheyesh schus ala minig, we could be malamet schus on the minig to be mekel. What's that limud schus? Ki kvar nisbar b'paiskim, because it's clear from the paiskim, she'ein lesser chazara ele im ken yesh chaim she'agdera yanasa reisachas. We're going to see from the paiskim that all of the restrictions on chazara are only if the heat of the kira is such that when you put it back onto the kira on Shabbos, it could really get hot. Minachayim zeh, minachayim. V'zein motzui kol kach. By their ovens, at least, the Chavetz Chaim says, it wasn't motzui that the heat of the tanner, remember, the tanner is gar fekatim, it doesn't have burning coals in it, or the coals are banked, it wasn't common that the heat of the tanner was such that by returning the cholent into the tanner, it's going to become reisachas, it's going to become yad seledis. Al kain ein lefakfik bazeh, and therefore we shouldn't pick a fight with those who are mekel. V'ayin l'kamei b'siv katan samiches, v'achar kach matzasi b'levush kidvareinu. Now let's go weiter in the Ramah. Says the Ramah, 4 lines down by the ois katan samiches for the Mishnah Berurah. Mihu, however, says the Ramah, so I just told you the kula dikadei shnia, and I just told you that there are those that are mekel. I said it's tov lahachmir. Now says the Ramah, mihu, im nitztanein. If you took the food off the fire and it got cold, what does it got cold mean? It's no longer hot food. You no longer would eat it as hot food. So if you took the cholent out and now it's nitztanein, lekule alma oser, even the day of shnia that's normally mekel, and says that chazara, if you took it off on Shabbos, so you want to put it back on Shabbos, you don't need daita lachzira, you don't need oid biyadai. You could do chazara, but not if the food got cold. If the food got cold, you cannot do chazara. That means that it mamish got cold, because if it already got cold, so it's certainly not yatzeledis boy. Now you might have an isser of bishul. So certainly, even the day of shnia would not be matir to do chazara on cold food. Because now mamish might be bishul. You see, bishul is more chomer by a davar lach. A pot of soup, a davar lach, liquid, if it got cold and you reheat it, that's considered bishul. Davar yavesh, a piece of brisket that got cold and you reheat it, we normally don't call that bishul. But even a dry food that has no gravy or soup or liquid, by bishul, which we're not going to say it's bishul to reheat it, why? For a different reason. Because once it gets cold, because the Magen Avram says that even according to the day of Shnia, who says that if the food was on the fire on Shabbos and you put it back on Shabbos, it's clear that when you put it back on the fire, it's only a continuation of the original act of bishul. Not so if the food is cold. If the food is now cold, it looks like initial placement on the fire, despite the fact that it was already on the fire on Shabbos. Why? Because it's cold food. Cold food, you put it on the fire, it looks like initial placement. It feels like initial placement. It feels like initial bishul. Also b'chol gavni, and therefore the Magen Avram would say that chazara would be aser. The chol zeki shemanichai atu b'makom sha'idei achoim yeh hayatze ledis boy. This whole discussion of chazara, says the Chavetz Chaim, is only when you're doing chazara onto a blech, onto a kira, that's hot enough that it has the potential to make the food hot. If it doesn't have the potential to make the food hot, then this whole discussion is not germane. Then you could definitely put it onto the fire, because it's not going to get hot, so it's not a problem. It's like putting it on your kitchen counter. Kasva Achrayim. There are Achrayim right. Whenever you have an instance where chazar is mutter afilu listoim pihatanur bedaf, you're allowed to close the oven up with a board, achara chazara, after you put the food back into the oven. What's he talking about here? So, we're discussing, Whoever set up the Dirshu schedule, there's so much material on today's page. I'm already 34 minutes into the share. I don't know how we're going to accomplish it, but what can I do? There's so much here. I hope I'm not going too fast and the Olam could pick it up. I see there are people who do these shiurim in 20 minutes. I don't know how. They're far more talented than I am. We have over here, we're discussing Chazara. Now says the Mishnah Berurah like this. Okay, we had the day of Rishona. We had the day of Shnia. I just told you, says the Mishnah Berurah, a case where according to the day of Shnia at least, if you had food, if you had a cholent inside the tanner on Shabbos, you took it out, and I just told you that according to the day of Shnia, it's still hot and everything else, you could put it back in. After you took it out, you put it down, you could put it back in. Or let's say even according to the day of Rishona. According to the day of Rishona, you had cholent. The day of Rishona is never matir l'soich hatanor. They're not matir shehiyah back into a tanner. So let's stick with the day of Shnia. The day of Shnia, you had the cholent in the tanner, you took it out, you're putting it back in. Now you want to close the door. Now closing the door might involve another shaila. Maybe you would look at it and you would say it's an act of hatmana. What's hatmana? Hatmana is surrounding a pot and insulating it. Well, if you take a pot and you put it into an oven that had an opening, and now you close the opening, is that an act of hatmana? Is that called circling the food in insulating material, and now you have a new shaila? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Kasva achronim. The mamakim shemota lahachzir, where chazar is mutter into an oven, mutter afilu listoim piatanu bedaf achar chazara, you would be allowed to shut the door of the oven with a board after you do the chazara. The stimas hadaf loy mikri hatmana. Closing it up does not constitute hatmana. And why? The reason is because hatmana is when you wrap a pot in insulating material. You're not wrapping a pot in insulating material. The pot is sitting uninsulated inside a space, inside the oven. Closing the door is not an act of hatmana. However, if by closing the door of the tanner, you're creating a situation where now the pot's really going to get hot, then it would be better not to close the door. What's the Mishnah Berurah saying? You see, I could just read this and move on. I touched the words, I could just move on. But you're missing what the Mishnah Berurah is saying. What the Mishnah Berurah is saying is like this. I told you, in Ois Cotton Samach Zayin, says the Chavetz Chaim, that according to the day of Shnia, where there's no problem of Chazara, when the food was on the fire on Shabbos and you're putting it back on Shabbos, I told you, you could take the cholent out of the oven on Shabbos, put it down, no daitei lachzira, no oida biyadai, you could serve the cholent, and then if it's still hot, you could put it back. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, I also told you, toiv lahachmir, not to do it. And I told you that one of the reasons why it's toiv lahachmir not to do it is who says that the day of Shnia is matir inside an oven? Maybe the day of Shnia is only matir al gabi akira. Who says that they're matir inside the oven, which is more merzi k'mavoshel? But then the Mishnah Berurah said, you could be malamet zchus on the minute to be mekel. What was the limit zchus? The limit zchus was, our ovens are not hot enough that when you put the food back into the oven, it's going to be reisachas. It's not really going to get hot. And therefore you could be mekel. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, but if by closing the door of the oven, it is going to be reisach, if by closing the door of the oven, you're going to create a situation where now after the chazara, the pot really will get hot, then you lose that limud zchus, and then you can't be mekel. Says the Mishnah Berurah right there, v'da, and you should know, the kol zehu be'en gecholim bayarois patanor, this whole discussion of chazara, remember, even the day of Shnia holds that you need gara fakatum. Even the day of Shnia holds that you can't take food off the fire on Shabbos and then put it back onto a kira that's not gara fakatum. It must be gara fakatum. Avlim yesham gechalim bayaros. If you have burning coals that are not gara for katum, pashut b'mishta de be'ein gara fakatum, afil lebeis hil asa lahachzer. You can't do chazara into a kira that's not gara fakatum. Now you might ask yourself a question. Again, I could just skip over this. You might ask yourself a question. Why does the Mishnah Berurah tell me that you can't do chazara back into an oven that's not garfakatum. If the kira wasn't garfakatum, how was the pot there in the first place? You're not allowed to do shehiyah if it's not garfakatum. The answer is because we learned at the beginning of the shir that you could, by chazara, you could take the pot off one kira and you could put it back onto another kira. So what if you had your cholent shehiyah in a tanner that was garfakatum, and now you took it out, and now according to the day shniya, you want to do chazara into a different tanner, and that tanner is not garfakatum. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that you're certainly not allowed to do. You can't do chazara into a tanner that's not garfakatum. Va'afilu tanner shalanu, even our tanurim, the dami likira that have a din of akira, gam ken also b'chol gavni. You can't do chazara back onto something that's not garfakatum. According to a kula that is brought down in the Sefer Yeshuas Yaakov, the le'inyan chazara, that in the context of the halacha of chazara, sagi kishagaraf agacholim lutzad echad, it's enough that the coals don't have to be totally removed from the tanner, they could just be swept off to one side. Yesh lahakel im garaf hagacholim ba'ayim sheyu rak lutzad echad. And again, to me, what this has to be talking about is when you're doing chazara into the tanner, into a different tanner, not the tanner that the cholent came from. Because the tanner that the cholent came from, unless I'm missing the boat, the tanner that the cholent came from had to have been garfakatum. Otherwise, how did you do shehiyah? In order to do shehiyah, in order to leave the cholent in that tanner going into Shabbos, that tanner had to be garfakatum. So if we're discussing a heter to do chazara into a kira that's not garfakatum, it's only garf to one side, it has to be talking about a different tanner, not the one that you did the shehiyah on. Okay, weiter in the Ramah, 3 lines up from the bottom. V'yeshayim, there are those that say, if you take food out of an oven on Shabbos, you are now not allowed to do hatmana. Says the Mishnah Berurah, which really we saw already in Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah told us this halacha. You did shehiyah inside a tanner. You took the cholent out of the tanner. Now your son says he wants hot cholent by shalosh shudas. You cannot go ahead now and do hatmana and wrap it in karim ksasais. Wrap it up in blankets and towels. Because the hatmana is a pu'ula chadasha. That's not chazara. This is initial hatmana. And initial hatmana is asar on Shabbos, even if it's a bedavar she'ena moisef hevel, even if it's in materials that do not add heat. Ve'ein time the b'Shabbos afilu bedavar she'ena moisef hevel. V'lachein. Therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, afilu haya adayin ha'meichel cham v'roiseach asar. Even if the food is still hot, you can't do this hatmana. Ve'em einoi tamin heitev b'soicham. But if you don't do a real hatmana, if you wrap it with towels, but you don't cover the top, shu pasuach milamal shari, that's mutter, d'zeh bikri hatmana. That's not called hatmana. So you want to take the cholent off the blech, and then you want to wrap it with towels on the bottom and on the side, but not on top. That's not hatmana. Okay, now we go on to a new halacha. Says the Ramah, 2 lines off the bottom, yesh oimrim. Yesh oimrim, there are those that say, and this is going to be a little bit of an astonishing halacha, but it'll become clear from the Mishnah Berurah. Yesh oimrim, there are those that say, the kol shehu samach lechashecha, if it's Erev Shabbos, close to Shkia, oy samach lebaruchu, or you're making early Shabbos, and it's close to Baruchu, shehu kabal Shabbos l'didan. They made early Shabbos, and according to the Ramah, Baruchu was Kabbalah Shabbos. So it's either very close to Shkia, when Shabbos is going to start no matter what, or you're making early Shabbos, it's very close to Baruchu, which is Kabbalah Shabbos. Imu samach kol kach, if it's so close to Shabbos, she'em nitztanein hakidera, that you have a pot that was on the fire. You took it off the fire, and you want to do chazara. If it's very close to Shabbos, if it's 5 minutes to Shkia, or it's 5 minutes to Baruchu, and it's so close that theoretically, if this pot that you just took off the fire would get cold, there isn't enough time to reheat it before Shabbos. Dinoi k'may b'Shabbos atzmai, the halacha would be like Shabbos itself. and Chazara would be Aser. Let's say this in English, plain English. What Ramah just told me is like this. There are those that say that there's an Isser of Chazara on Erev Shabbos, the same way there's an Isser of Chazara on Shabbos. What's that Isser of Chazara on Erev Shabbos? The Isser of Chazara on Erev Shabbos would be, you took the chicken soup off the fire very close to Shabbos. Now, how long does it take to reheat? Let's say your chicken soup was cold. So let's say you have a small pot. Let's say it would take 20 minutes on the fire to reheat it. You took the chicken soup off the fire 5 minutes before Shabbos. Theoretically, if that pot of chicken soup would get cold, theoretically, it doesn't have to get cold. Theoretically, if it would be cold, would you have enough time to reheat it between now and Kabbalah Shabbos? No. It takes 20 minutes to reheat it. You only have 5 minutes left to Shabbos. In that case, you're not allowed to put it back on the fire on Erev Shabbos. Why? Because the fear is that you're going to put the pot back on Erev Shabbos, and now if the Shabbos starts, Shemi Yechat B'Gacholim. You might do something to accelerate the reheating process. And therefore, you need all the Tanoim here of Chazara. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Ayin, where he gives us a beautiful Hagdama to this halacha. Yesh Oimrim dekol shu samach. Kedei lahavin divrei Yesh Oimrim. In order to understand this halacha and this Yesh Oimrim, muchrach ani laharach k'tzas. I need to give you a little bit of a ma'aracha to explain this. Tehine. HaTosfos v'harosh v'siyatam. Tosfos, Rosh, the other Rishonim will hold like them. Hoichichu, they prove, the be'erev Shabbos nami shaykh dinei Chazara. There's an Isser of Chazara that applies on Erev Shabbos. Dahainu. What is that case? Im natal mi ba'od yoim min hakira oy min hataner l'didon. If you take food off of a kira back in the day, or from one of our tanurim, says the Mishnah Berurah, that had a din of a kira, aser lahachzer alav, you're not allowed to put the food back on Erev Shabbos, Eli im kein hu gar fakatim. Unless the kira is gar fakatim. V'hikshu al zeh, and they ask on this, im kein da asvina lahachzer afilu b'erev Shabbos. There's a very fundamental issue. If you're telling me that there's an Isser of Chazara on Erev Shabbos, what exactly is the geder of that halacha? Im yisalik akderim and akira be'erev Shabbos b'hashkama. Let's say I got up early Friday morning. We saw earlier that there's an inyan to do your achanos for Shabbos early in the morning, Friday morning. So I got up early Friday morning, I davened vasikin, and I put up my soup very early Friday morning. It took 2 hours to cook, and now I took it off the fire. Now I'm restricted by Chazara? I'm not allowed to put it back? Am I allowed to put it back 11 o'clock in the morning? Am I allowed to put it back 1 o'clock in the afternoon if Shabbos is 7 o'clock? Shabbos is 8 o'clock? What's the geder? In Yisalik Akterim and Akir B'Erev Shabbos Pashkama, if I took the pot off early on Erev Shabbos, Lo Yeh Yochel HaHachzir? I'm not going to be allowed on Erev Shabbos to put it back on the fire to get it hot for Shabbos? Ve'ezeh shir zman nostu chachamim al zeh. What's together? What's the time constraint here? When is this negeya? Umaski and the Rishonim conclude, if when you want to put the pot back on the fire, it's so close to nightfall, it's so close to Shabbos, that if the food would be cold, you wouldn't be able to heat it up properly in that amount of time. You wouldn't be allowed to put it back on without garuf v'kotum. Now let's understand something. Shehiyah, putting a pot on Erev Shabbos and leaving it on Shabbos, is always aser without garuf v'kotum. So you're going to have to do grifa uktima at some point. Before Shabbos, if you want to do shehiyah, it's going to have to be garuf v'kotum, right? I mean, that's shehiyah 101. You need to have grufu uktuma, right? So obviously you're going to do grufu uktuma at some point. But the question is, could you put it on now? Could you put it back on the fire when it's not garuf v'kotum? And the problem over here, says the Mishnah Berurah, is dimiyah mutter ozla hachzir. Our fear is, if you're going to be allowed to do chazara on Erev Shabbos, so close to Shabbos, Yachzer Gam b'Shabbos. You're going to come to do Chazara on Shabbos too. V'kulei chodek zerehi. The reason we're answering the Chazara on Erev Shabbos is because of the Chazara on Shabbos. Ubi Shabbos also Shemi Yechata. And on Shabbos we can't let you do it if it's not Grufa Uktuma because of Shemi Yechata B'Gacholim. V'chol zeh hu das yeshayimim she'eskira harama v'ayesh bekilin hu das Rashi v'siyatoi t'sfir lehu d'loi gazra chazara kiyam mishachashecha v'loi b'bayayim. The Mekilim that we'll see it tomorrow shir hold that no, there's only restrictions on Chazara on Shabbos, not on Erev Shabbos. Ois Kat Ayin Aleph, the Mishnah Berurah spoke about two cases. One is that it's close to Shkia, Samach Lechashecha. The other one was it was close to Baruchu. Ois Samach LeBaruchu Bizmanam. In their days, Hayunayagid Loima Baruchu Behegdim, they made early Shabbos. They said Baruchu early, and that was their Kabbalah Shabbos. The Kamash Balan, the Kevin Dal Yidei Baruchu Hu Kabbalah Shabbos. Since that marks their Kabbalah Shabbos, Hevik Shabbos Gomer. Will be Inan Sha'isi Ashir Yeh Kind of Baruchu Dafka. V'ayim b'Magen Avram Shecholik Al Zeh Sfir Lo Zeh Ashir Rakoid B'Chashecha V'Loi Kaidem Baruchu. The Magen Avram disagrees. Ice cut 9 bays in Musamach Kolkach. If it's so close that you wouldn't have enough time to theoretically reheat the pot. Hainu afilu hu kaidem shkia sachama is man. Even if it's a half hour before shkia, but it would take you an hour to reheat your pot, then you're not allowed to do chazar on Erev Shabbos. Dinay kamay b'Shabbos. V'hainu rak le'inyan debe'inan grufa uktuma kamay b'Shabbos. But realize, says the Mishnah Berurah, this yesh oimrim that's telling you that there's a restriction against Chazara on Erev Shabbos is only negaya to the requirement of Grufa Uketuma. You don't need Daitoi Lahachzira. It doesn't. No one is saying that if you took your chicken soup off the fire 11 o'clock Friday morning, you had to have Daitoi Lahachzira in order to put it back before Shabbos starts late in the day. You don't have to have Oida B'Yada. You don't have to be holding the chicken soup pot all day long. It's only Grufa Uktuma. This Yesh Oimrim is saying, if you want to do Chazar on Erev Shabbos before Shabbos starts, and you're doing it so close to Shabbos that theoretically you would not have time to reheat that pot, you can only do that Chazara if it's Grufa Uktuma. Now you're going to do Grufa Uktuma before Shabbos starts because you need Grufa Uktuma for Shehiyah purposes. But you don't want to do Grufa Uktuma to the last minute. You don't want to do Grufa Uktuma. You don't want to put the blech on an hour before Shabbos. Why? Because you want to get your soup nice and hot. You want to put your blech on a minute before Shabbos. But this Yesh Oimrim says you're not allowed to put the chicken soup on without the blech an hour before Shabbos if that hour wouldn't be long enough to reheat the pot. The chayla gamri, if the pot of food is totally raw, shari lahachse sabach lechashecha mamish, you could put it on right before Shabbos. Hafilu la'ina grufa uktuma. You don't even need grufa uktuma. Kamesha kasav sevalif. Remember, for shehiyah purposes, right? If your food is totally raw, you don't even need grufa uktuma. We're not afraid shebi yechata b'gacholim. You gave up on your food for Friday night. Ois Kat 9 Gimel, we're giving Erev Shabbos the din of Shabbos Atzmoi. V'davka acha shenigmar kol bishal aktero manicha lamed alikira ad Erev lishmar chuma bazehu demachmirinon im netala shaloi lahachzir l'she'ena grufa. Again, we're talking about fully cooked food. Our kol zman shaloi nespashal kol tzarcha. If the food is not mavushal kol tzarcha on Erev Shabbos, noitlo machzir b'kol gavni. You can do what you want. The loishak lemigzer the yakster gam b'Shabbos, because we don't have to make a gzera that if we allow you to put a pot of raw food on 2 minutes before Shkia, you might come to put a pot of raw food onto the fire on Shabbos, because Tezehu Mavashal b'Shabbos. That would be Issa Bishul 101 Daraisa. Upshita de Bizdar B'Hachi Afil Isharis Lahachzim B'Yayim V'Yesh B'Chmir and Gam Bazem Mishum Loi Plug. Okay? Wow. I hope that I was able to give over this very complex material that is so full of nuances. You should know, Rabbi Isai, there are at least 15 nuances that I even left out, that I didn't go through. We do what we do. We're not learning Hilchos Shabbos Be'iyun. So I hope that I'm giving over the material cogently and clearly. The Rebbeinu Shalom should be mezakimi that I should have the schus to do that. Thank you so much for joining me for Liman HaTorah. The schus of Liman HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshua's and Refuah's Parnas and Shidduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Kol Tzedek. B'mhera v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.